The stagecoach wheels creaked against the dry earth as dust rose in plumes that drifted across the main street of Hollow Bend. People left their porches and shops, drawn out by the sound of iron chains rattling louder than the harnesses of the mules. At first it was a curiosity, the kind that drew the whole town like flies to a dropped biscuit. But when the figure appeared, slumped yet defiant, every whisper turned into a hush. They dragged her down from the coach like a trophy. Shackles clamped her wrists, the heavy chain pulled tight between them and cinched to her waist, making every step a fight against iron. She stumbled once in the dust, but straightened quickly, eyes burning beneath the tangle of her dark hair. Some claimed they saw a smile flicker there, though whether it was mockery or madness no one could say. Her name had traveled farther than she ever had. Mara Dusk, the outlaw who robbed payroll trains without firing a shot. The woman who held up 3 banks and rode away in daylight while the sheriff's men scrambled behind her. Mothers used her name to scare children into obedience. Men spat it like a curse, though some spoke with admiration they would never admit aloud. And now, here she was chained, dirty, yet still with a kind of wild fire in her eyes that no lock could extinguish. The captors strutted proudly, puffed up by their prize. 2 bounty hunters, brothers by blood and reputation, walked on either side of her, one gripping her elbow hard enough to leave bruises. "Step lively," the older barked. "You're worth more standing than dragging." The words drew a chuckle from his partner, but Mara said nothing. She had not spoken since they caught her, though the cut on her cheek suggested the silence wasn't voluntary. The townsfolk kept their distance, whispering among themselves. Children peeked out from behind skirts. One bold boy called out, "She, don't look so tough," and was quickly hushed by his mother. Mara turned her head slowly toward him, and the boy shrank back, eyes wide. She did not speak, but the look was enough to silence him better than his mother's scolding. The sheriff met them outside the jailhouse. His chest puffed in triumph, though the glory was not his. "Well, well," he drawled, adjusting the brim of his hat. "The infamous Mara Dusk, right here in Hollow Bend. Didn't think I'd live to see the day." He waved the bounty hunters inside, already planning how he'd wire the governor about this prize. The air was thick with the smell of dust and horses, but also with something heavier, fear mixed with fascination. People leaned in as though drawn by a magnet, yet none dared too close. Mara's presence unsettled them. She was chained, beaten, and yet, somehow unconquered. It was then that another figure appeared at the far end of the street. A tall man, shoulders broad from years of labor, hands scarred but steady. His clothes were plain, worn from work on the land, and his face shaded by the brim of a weathered hat. The silent rancher. He did not join the crowd's whispers or spit at the outlaw as some did. He simply leaned against the post outside the blacksmith's shop, watching with unreadable eyes. His presence was so quiet, so still, that most overlooked him entirely. But Mara's gaze found him, even in the sea of strangers. For the briefest moment, her eyes met his. She did not smile. She did not scowl. She simply looked, and something wordless passed between them before the bounty hunter yanked her forward again. The crowd cheered as the jailhouse doors slammed shut behind her, iron clanging against iron. To them, it was the end of a legend. But for the rancher, still leaning in the shade, it was only the beginning of a story no one else yet knew. Hollow Bend was the kind of town where everyone's business was everyone's business. Word traveled quicker than a prairie fire, and before long the saloon, the general store, even the barber's chair buzzed with talk of Mara Dusk's capture. The sheriff strutted through it all like a rooster in the yard. But in the far corners of town, there was one man who had no part in the chatter. To most, he was simply the rancher. He owned a patch of land west of Hollow Bend, where his cattle grazed and his fences sagged under years of wind and weather. He came into town rarely, usually for supplies or nails to mend what storms tore down. He wasn't the sort to linger, nor the kind to share stories by the stove-in. The mercantile. People knew his face, but not his life. Some said he'd come down from the Dakotas after the war, carrying scars he never spoke of. Others claimed he'd buried a wife and child in the red earth beyond his fields, and silence was the only companion he kept. Whatever the truth, Elias had learned long ago that words cost more than they were worth. So he let others talk while he worked, ate, and lived in quiet. On the day Mara Dusk was dragged in chains, Elias had come to town for nothing more than a sack of feed and a spool of wire. He leaned outside the blacksmith's shop, hat low against the sun, when the stagecoach pulled in. Dust clung to the air like smoke, and the crowd swelled with excitement. He could have turned away, walked to his wagon, and gone back to the ranch without ever knowing. But something in the hush that swept over the crowd made him pause. When he saw her, he didn't feel the thrill the others did. No pride that justice had been done, no relief that the outlaw who haunted headlines was finally caged. What he felt was recognition. Not of her face, though he'd heard her name like anyone else. It was something deeper, something he couldn't place. A weariness in her stride, a stubborn light in her eyes even as the chains bit into her wrists. Elias had seen that look before in the mirror, in the soldiers who walked home from war, in anyone who'd lost too much yet refused to bow under it. The townsfolk whispered, pointing and gawking as though she were a beast from a traveling show. Elias only watched. She turned her head once, scanning the crowd with a gaze sharp as broken glass. For a heartbeat, her eyes locked with his. There were no words, no nods, no grand gestures. But Elias felt it, something unspoken passing between them. As if she saw through the hat brim, through the silence, straight into the quiet life he'd built out of loss and grit. And he, in turn, saw not the outlaw of dime novels, but a woman bound in chains who hadn't surrendered. He thought about leaving then, about walking back to his wagon and forgetting he'd ever seen her. After all, it wasn't his fight. She was the sheriff's problem, the bounty hunter's triumph, the town's story to spin over drinks. But Elias lingered. He stayed through the cheering, through the clanging of the jailhouse door, through the sheriff's boastful words, and when the crowd began to scatter, Elias finally moved. He picked up his feed sack, loaded it onto his wagon, and guided the mule back toward his ranch. His face betrayed nothing, his mouth gave no sound. But his mind carried the weight of that brief look, heavier than the load behind him. By nightfall, while the town slept easy believing a legend had ended, Elias Cade sat in the dim light of his ranch house, sharpening a knife in silence. Rhythmic scrape of stone on steel echoed through the lonely room. Outside, coyotes yipped at the moon, but inside, Elias's thoughts circled back to the outlaw's eyes. Something told him her story wasn't finished, and somehow, neither was his. The jailhouse of Hollow Bend wasn't built for legends. It was a squat wooden building with 2 iron-barred cells and a pot-bellied stove that smoked when the wind shifted wrong. The sheriff used it more for drunkards and card cheats than hardened outlaws. That night, it was host to Mara Dusk, a name that could rattle lawmen from Kansas to New Mexico. Sheriff Calder paced the front office like a man already rehearsing speeches for the governor. He was broad around the middle, his badge polished, brighter than his boots, and his ego even shinier than both. "By God," he said for the 10th time that evening, "I'll be the one remembered for bringing her down." The bounty hunters, the Rixley brothers, exchanged glances but said nothing. They were the ones who had actually done the work, trailed Mara for weeks across canyons and desert, caught her half-starved near the Pecos, shackled her wrists and rode night and day to drag her here. Yet now Calder strutted like a peacock, basking in glory he hadn't earned. Tomorrow, Calder went on, we'll hitch her to the prison wagon and send her east. Folks in Santa Fe can deal with her trial. Too dangerous to keep her on longer than that. He puffed out his chest, already imagining the newspapers. Sheriff Calder secures infamous outlaw. One of the brothers cleared his throat. And about our fee? Calder waved him off. You'll get your gold when the governor wires it. Until then, she stays put. You can bed down at the saloon. The younger Rixley bristled, but the older pressed a hand on his arm. They had dealt with men. Like Calder before, loud with words, tight with coin. No sense starting a fight in front of the outlaw listening from her cell. Behind the bars, Mara sat on the wooden bench, chains heavy around her wrists. She hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Her eyes followed Calder's every movement, though, sharp and steady, as if memorizing every weakness in the room. Calder noticed the stare and chuckled nervously. Don't bother plotting, Missy. Iron's thick, lock's strong, and I've got the key right here. He jingled it at his belt, then turned back to his desk, muttering, By this time tomorrow, you'll be halfway out of my jurisdiction. But halfway was still too far for Calder's comfort. The governor's men would not arrive until midday. That meant one night with the most infamous outlaw in the territory under his roof. His jailhouse had never been tested by someone like her. One cell door, one lock, one distracted Deputy Calder didn't trust the odds. And so, later that night, Calder wandered into the saloon looking for solutions at the bottom of a whiskey glass. He boasted to anyone who would listen about his captive. He laughed too loudly, slapped backs too hard. And then, lowering his voice, he floated the idea. Could use a place to keep her till morning, he said, his words sticky with drink. Somewhere out of sight. Jailhouse ain't built for this kind of devil. The card players chuckled. What, Calder? Afraid she'll charm her way out. Or maybe outsmart you, another said, drawing laughter. Calder's face flushed, but he forced a grin. Just being prudent, he muttered. Prudent men keep their legends under lock and key. That was when a quiet voice from the back of the room offered something unexpected. I've got space. The words were simple, but they carried. Men turned in surprise. Elias Cade stood near the wall, hands in his pockets, hat brim low. He had come only to trade for nails and a sack of flour, but fate had a way of pulling him where he didn't belong. Calder squinted. Space? For her? Elias nodded once. Barn solid. Better than that jail of yours. The room went silent. The idea of a man volunteering to take the outlaw under his roof seemed madness. Calder studied him, weighing whether the offer was serious. Finally, pride and fear made the decision for him. Fine, Calder said, though his tone was more relief. Then authority. You keep her till morning. But she tries anything, you'll answer for it. Elias didn't flinch. He just tipped his hat slightly, the gesture of a man who had already decided what he would do. Across the saloon, Mara Dusk's fate shifted, though no one realized it yet. The sheriff's decision was met with disbelief. A murmur rippled through the saloon, followed by bursts of laughter and disbelief. You're giving her to a rancher? Someone scoffed. Barn'll be ash come morning, another jeered. A card dealer chuckled into his sleeve. Maybe she slit his throat before sunrise. Calder ignored the remarks, though his face burned. Pride kept him from admitting the truth that the jail felt like a wooden box too thin to hold such. A legend. He'd found a convenient solution, and if the quiet rancher was fool enough to shoulder the burden, so be it. By the time Elias Cade stepped into the night, the deal was already made. He crossed the street with his usual measured gait, nothing in his stride to betray the weight of the task he had accepted. Outside the jailhouse, the Rixley brothers leaned against the porch rail, chewing tobacco and eyeing him with suspicion. You? The older one said, spitting into the dirt. "Sheriff's trusting her to you?" Elias met his gaze but said nothing. Silence was answer enough that the younger Rixley snorted. "Don't make sense. You're no lawman." "Lawman or not, Sheriff," Calder said, pushing through the door with the keys jangling. "He's the one I've picked. Unless you two want to babysit her all night yourselves." That shut them up. They wanted their bounty, not more work. Grumbling, they stepped aside. Calder unlocked the cell, and for the first time since her arrival, Mara Dusk stood without. Chains fixed to the bars, her wrists were still shackled, the heavy iron dragging against her waist, but the space between her and the law suddenly widened. She stretched subtly, rolling her shoulders as if the air itself felt freer. Her eyes flicked toward Elias, cool and unreadable, before turning back to the sheriff. "Move," Calder barked, shoving her forward. "You'll be rid of us soon enough." The outlaw did not stumble this time. She walked under her own power. Chin raised, the chains clinking with each step. The sound followed them out into the street, echoing in the hush that fell over Hollow Bend. People gathered on porches and behind lamplight, watching the strange procession, the outlaw, the sheriff, the silent rancher, and the rattling of iron dot at the hitching post waited Elias's wagon. Calder tossed the reins toward him with a grunt. "Best keep her chained. I want her breathing come morning." Elias caught the reins, his expression steady. He climbed onto the bench seat, guiding the mule as Mara was help-shoved really into the back. The wagon creaked under the added weight, wood groaning as if it knew who it carried. They rolled out of town beneath a crescent moon, the glow of Hollow Bend fading behind them. The road stretched empty, lined with sagebrush and scattered rocks, the night wind cool against their faces. For a long while, there was no sound but the steady clip of hooves and the occasional rattle of chain. Mara broke the silence first. Her voice was low, rough from disuse. "You're not like the others." Elias said nothing. She studied the back of his head, the brim of his hat silhouetted against the stars. "Don't care to talk?" she asked, her tone half amused. Still no reply. After a while, she leaned back against the wagon rail with a faint smile. "Suit yourself, rancher. Silence makes for fine company." When they reached the ranch, Elias led her into the barn. The structure was simple but solid, heavy beams, thick doors, and stalls that smelled of hay and horse sweat. He gestured toward an empty stall and unlatched the door. Mara stepped inside, her chain scraping on the wooden floor. He secured the door. With a heavy bar, Ben placed a bucket of water and a loaf of bread within reach. No words, no threats, just provisions. Mara raised an eyebrow. Hospitality from a jailer? That's a first. Elias met her eyes for a long moment, then turned away, moving to tend the lanterns. His silence lingered in the air, heavier than any speech. As the barn settled into quiet, Mara lay back on the straw, staring at the rafters. She had been caged many times, but never like this. Never in a place that felt less like a prison and more like something she couldn't name. And somewhere in the darkness, Elias sat with his back against the barn wall, knife resting in his hand, listening to the outlaw breathe as the night stretched long and strange between them. The barn settled into darkness as the night deepened, the only light a sliver of moon that leaked through the cracks in the boards. The cattle shifted in their stalls, hooves rustling straw, and the barn owl in the rafters gave a low, steady hoot. Outside, coyotes yipped at the edge of the prairie, their cries rising and falling like mournful laughter. Mara Dusk lay on her side in the straw, the weight of iron biting at her wrists and waist. She had learned, long ago, to rest lightly never. Fully asleep, never fully awake. The chains clinked whenever she shifted, and she tested them against the stall rail, tugging and twisting, searching for weakness. There was none. Whoever had forged them knew their craft. Across the barn, Elias Cade sat with his back against a support beam, his long frame shadowed by the dim lantern. His hat lay beside him, his head tilted slightly forward as if he were dozing, but his hands rested steady on his knees. A knife glinted faintly in his palm, moving slow against a whetstone in steady rhythm. Scrape, pause, scrape. Doesn't make sense, Mara muttered finally, her voice breaking the long silence. Then Bounty Boy should have kept me. Sheriff should have locked me tight in that cell. But here I am, in a rancher's barn, with bread in my belly and water at my side. Elias didn't answer. He didn't even look up. She smirked faintly. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you the sort who talks only to his cattle? Still no reply. Only the whisper of stone against steel. Mara shifted onto her back, staring at the dark rafters. You're a strange one. Most men can't hold silence. They fill it with threats, boasts, prayers, anything to drown out what quiet says back to them. But you, she studied him out of the corner of her eye. You let it sit. The outlaws. Voice softened, almost as if speaking to herself. Silence don't scare you. That makes you dangerous. The lantern guttered, shadows stretching across the barn walls. For a long moment, the only sound was the mule's slow chewing in the corner. Then, without a word, Elias set his knife aside and stood. He walked to her stall, the boards creaking under his boots. Mara tensed instinctively, ready for a blow or another chain, but instead, she watched him kneel beside the locked door. The key scraped softly in the lock. The iron bar slid free. Mara sat up sharply. What are you doing? Elias opened the door just wide enough to step inside. He set down a tin cup of fresh water and a half loaf of bread, closer than before. Then he reached for her shackles. Her eyes narrowed, suspicious. What's this, rancher? Your idea of mercy? Or are you hoping I'll owe you something later? He didn't reply. He simply worked at the lock with a smaller key, the click loud. In the still barn. The iron fell loose around her wrists, clattering to the floor. She rubbed the angry red marks on her skin, staring at him as though trying to puzzle out his meaning. You're either the bravest fool I've met, she said, slowly, or the kindest. Elias met her gaze, his face unreadable, and then turned away. He picked up the fallen shackles, carried them out of the stall, and set them aside. Without a word, he walked back to his place against the beam, sat, and resumed sharpening his knife. Mara held her wrist to the lantern light, marveling at the sudden freedom. She expected a demand, an ultimatum, some price for his silence, but none came. The rancher had given her water, bread, and freedom of her hands, and asked nothing in return. For the first time since her capture, Mara Dusk felt unsettled. Chains. She understood. Violence, threats, and bargains were the law of her world. But this wordless act of trust was stranger than any prison she'd ever known. Lying back in the straw, free hands folded across her chest, she whispered into the darkness. What game are you playing, rancher? But Elias gave no answer. And as the coyotes sang and the night stretched on, the silence between them grew heavier than any chain. The moon had sunk lower by the time Mara stirred again. The barn was steeped in quiet, that particular kind that only came in the deepest part of night when even the wind seemed to sleep. She sat up slowly, brushing straw from her hair, and studied the figure across the way. Elias sat exactly where he had been before, back against the beam, hat tilted forward. The knife rested on his knee now, the whetstone at his side. His breathing was steady, untroubled. Mara narrowed her eyes. He wasn't asleep, she could tell. Men who slept didn't hold themselves that still. Her wrists were free. The thought kept circling, a restless bird in her mind. Free wrists meant she could fight. Free wrists meant she could slip out, vanish into the night before the sheriff ever thought to check on her. The chains at her waist and ankles were gone too. She had tested while Elias wasn't looking. He had released them all, left her unbound. Any other jailer would have been a fool to do so. But this man, he hadn't asked for promises, hadn't raised a pistol, hadn't even spoken a word. He had simply handed her freedom as though it were bread or water, an ordinary thing. Mara's hand strayed to the latch of the stall door. It wasn't locked anymore. She could walk out right now. She could take his mule, his wagon, his very life if she wanted. And yet her hand hovered. Something in the rancher's silence pinned her where chains had failed. "You don't make sense," she muttered under her breath. Elias lifted his head slightly, eyes catching hers across the shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. "You're not afraid," she continued, almost challenging him. "Not of me, not of what I might do." She rose to her feet, her full height revealed in the dim light. "That's either because you're braver than most men I've met, or you're tired enough not to care." Elias said nothing. His expression was calm, like the face of stone mesas weathered by 100 storms. Mara's chest tightened with frustration. She had made sheriffs beg, bounty hunters curse, men double-cross her for less. But this rancher, his silence was immovable. No threat, no plea, no bargain. Only choice. The realization hit her like a punch. He was leaving the decision to her. She could escape, she could betray him, she could stay. He was offering nothing and demanding nothing in return. That, more than iron, kept her still. Slowly, Mara sat back down in the straw, leaning against the stall rail. Her heart beat hard in her chest, though she tried not to show it. She hated choices. Chains were simple. You fought them or you broke them. But a man who gave you freedom without condition, that was a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. She broke the silence one last time. "Why?" Her voice was quieter now, rawer. "Why do this? You don't know me. You don't know what I've done." Elias held her gaze a long while. His mouth opened slightly, and for a moment Mara thought he might finally speak. But instead, he shook his head once slow, deliberate. Then he tipped his hat back down, as though the question didn't require words. Mara laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "A wordless saint," she said, "or a damned fool." The rancher didn't flinch at either title. He simply sat, listening to the night, as if her fate had already been placed in her own hands. For the first time in years, Mara Dusk felt the weight of her choices press heavier than any chain. And though she could not say why, she did not move toward the door. She stayed in the stall, free but bound by something invisible, a wordless trust she hadn't asked for but could not bring herself to break. Dawn crept slowly across the prairie, spilling pale light through the slats of the barn. The rooster crowed once, then again, his call echoing across the quiet fields. The cattle shifted in their stalls, restless with the coming day. Mara Dusk sat awake, back against the stall rail, straw tangled in her hair. She hadn't slept. Freedom was a restless bedfellow. The night had given her 1,000 chances to slip away, yet she'd remained caught in the strange quiet that wrapped itself around the rancher. Elias Cade was already moving. He tended the animals with his steady hands, sliding hay into troughs, checking the mule's harness. He worked with the same silence as before, as though she were no more dangerous than the morning chores. Mara watched him, suspicion and curiosity battling in her chest. Finally, he walked to the corner where her chains lay coiled like a discarded snake. He picked them up, waved them in one hand, and then, without ceremony, carried them outside. She heard the heavy clatter as he tossed them into the wagon bed. When he returned, he carried not iron, but a bridle and reins. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not thinking?" He stopped at her stall. For a long moment, They studied each other, her eyes sharp as a drawn blade, his as steady as stone. Without a word, he unlatched the door and stepped back. His gesture was simple, almost casual, an open path. Mara rose slowly, testing the ground as if it might give way beneath her. Just like that, no guard, no sheriff waiting outside. Elias didn't answer. He only held out the reins. The horse behind him stamped, tossing its head, eager for the morning ride. It was a fine animal, better than the half-starved nags she'd stolen in her outlaw days. Her hand twitched with the old instinct to grab, mount, and flee without looking back. But something about the way he stood there, offering without demand, made her hesitate. "You know what I'll do," she said softly. "You know I won't stay." He gave the smallest nod. Mara's throat tightened. No bargain, no condition. No price, just trust, naked and unreasonable. It was the first kindness she had been shown in years, and it unsettled her more than any chain ever had. She stepped forward and took the reins. Their fingers brushed, brief, unintentional, but enough. His hand was calloused, scarred, the hand of a man who worked the land and carried his burdens in silence. Her hand was lean, restless, marked by a life of theft and running. Two worlds collided in that brief touch. With a sharp breath, she mounted the horse. The animal snorted, muscles bunching beneath her. She turned it toward the open barn doors. The prairie beyond painted gold by the rising sun. Freedom stretched wide, endless and waiting. For a moment, Mara paused. She looked back over her shoulder. Elias stood where she had left him, one hand resting on the stall rail, his hat brim shadowing his face. He gave no signal, no farewell, only that steady, unreadable gaze. She almost spoke then, almost asked why, almost said thank you. But the words stuck in her throat, foreign and heavy. Instead, she tightened her grip on the reins. The horse surged forward. Hooves struck earth, and the barn fell away behind her. The wind rushed against her face, tearing through her tangled hair. The chains, the jailhouse, the sheriff, all of it vanished in the pounding rhythm of escape. Yet as she rode into the horizon, one thought clung tighter than the saddle beneath her. She was free, not because she had stolen it, not because she had fought for it, but because a silent rancher had placed it in her hands. The weight of that gift was heavier than iron. The prairie swallowed her whole. Mara rode hard at first, pushing the horse as though distance alone could erase the night she'd spent in that barn. The wind clawed at her hair, the sun rose at her back, and the world stretched wide and empty ahead. Each hoofbeat was a drum of freedom, the kind she had lived for all her years fast. Fleeting UNTAMED. But by midday, the urgency faded. She slowed the horse to a trot, then a walk, until the land itself seemed to insist on silence. Sagebrush rolled in waves, the horizon shimmered with heat, and there was no one to chase her. She was free, free in the way she had always demanded to be. Yet the weight of freedom pressed differently now. Her wrists were bare, the red marks of the shackles fading to shadows. She traced them absently with her thumb, remembering the moment they had fallen. Away. Not because she'd picked the lock, not because she'd killed a guard or slipped a key from some fool's pocket. No, those chains had fallen because a man she did not know had chosen to remove them. Mara shook her head, scowling at the thought. Trust was a language she didn't speak. In her world, every gift carried a hook, every kindness hid a knife. Yet, Elias Cade had asked for nothing, said nothing, wanted nothing. His silence had been heavier than any bargain she'd ever struck. By nightfall, she camped in a dry wash, the stars wheeling overhead. She chewed hard bread from her own satchel, though she remembered the fresh loaf he'd left her in the barn. She drank from her canteen, but the memory of the cool water he had set beside her lingered. Everything he had done was simple, ordinary, and yet, to her, it was more dangerous than gunfire. She lay back against the earth, staring at the constellations. "Why'd you do it?" she whispered to the sky. The stars offered no answer. Neither had he. The days stretched on. She rode farther west, toward the borderlands where the law thinned and men forgot names. Yet no matter how many miles she put between herself and Hollow Bend, the rancher's image rode with her, silent, steady, unshaken by her legend. She tried to banish it with speed, with plans, with the familiar hunger for gold and escape. But his silence filled the spaces where her thoughts used to be sharp and certain. In the still hours before dawn, Mara caught herself wondering what he had seen in her eyes that night, why he hadn't shackled her tighter, why he hadn't sold her out for the price on her head. She had been worth more than a ranch, more than 100 cattle, more than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. And still, he had let her ride free. That truth unsettled her more than any chain. Weeks later, in a dusty border town, Mara sat at a saloon table, cards spread before her, whiskey burning down her throat. Laughter and music rattled the walls. But her mind was far away. When a drunkard mentioned Hollow Bend, she tensed, waiting for her name to follow. But instead, he spoke only of the sheriff who had strutted through town with empty boasts, the one who had nearly lost his prize. The rancher's name was never mentioned. His part in the story remained buried in silence, as he likely intended. Mara leaned back in her chair, lips curving in the faintest smile. Let the world think she had escaped by her own hand. That was the story they wanted, and it was one she could live with. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Her fate had not been stolen or seized. It had been given, and though she rode free, untamed as ever, a seed had been planted in the wild soil of her heart. Someday, she thought, she might return to Hollow Bend, not for the sheriff, not for the chains, but for the man whose silence had spoken louder than any vow. Until then, she would carry that silence with her, heavier than iron, steadier than iron. Stone. Her fate was no longer the one she had written with guns and stolen gold. It had been rewritten by the quiet mercy of a silent rancher.